What would you do if the meal you spent all morning preparing for the man you loved was smashed to pieces before sunset, and the next day you still had to stand beside him in the market and smile as though hope had not been beaten out of your home? That day began with heat, hunger, debt, and love. Before the sun had even climbed fully into the sky, Tu Tien was already awake, sweat beading on her forehead, thinking not of herself but of Jack and the deadline closing around his life like a tightening noose. The 15th was coming. The bank mortgage had to be redeemed. Worry had carved itself into Jack's face so deeply that even sleep no longer softened him. So while the whole week promised only harsh sunlight and suffocating weather, Tu Tien chose to rise and make something nourishing with her own hands. She would soak the rice, grind the batter, buy pig heart and kidney, gather mugwort, and cook him a healing meal. She would also make banduk to sell at the nearby market, hoping each small bag might become one more stone laid against the flood pressing toward them. But under the same sun that witnessed her devotion, another future was taking shape. A plot of land that looked like peace would reveal itself to be a lie. Uncle Dung's hope would curdle into fury. Men would come, fists would fly, their bowls, tables, pots, and fragile safety would be smashed apart. And still, in the middle of the wreckage, Jack and Tu Tien would sit together over hot stew and half-saved cakes, proving that love sometimes survives not by escaping violence, but by continuing to feed one another after everything has already been broken. Morning pressed into the room before the day had even properly begun. The air was thick and still, the kind of summer heat that makes the skin damp before a person has done any work at all. Tu Tien opened her eyes, touched the sweat already gathering at her temples, and turned instinctively toward her phone. The weather forecast offered no comfort. Day after day of sun, day after day of dry heat. No rain, no mercy. She lay still for a few moments, thinking, what should she harvest? What would sell well in the nearby market? The vegetables were there, the fruit was there, but the heat changed people's appetites, their moods, even the things they were willing to spend money on. Her eyes fell on the old recipe notebook nearby. She reached for it and turned the pages slowly until the answer settled in her chest. Banduk. Simple, familiar, affordable, filling. If she made it well, people would buy it. If people bought it, perhaps tomorrow would feel a little less frightening. She traced the recipe with one finger, whispering reminders to herself about proportions, heat, texture. It had to come out smooth. It had to hold together. It had to taste like care. Then she thought of Jack. Lately, he had been carrying the pressure of the bank mortgage like a wound hidden under his clothes. He tried to speak calmly. He tried to look strong. But she had seen the fatigue in the way he sat, in the way he stared at nothing after a meal, in the way silence lingered longer around him now. Her heart tightened. That decided the rest of the morning. She rose at once. 5 bowls of plain rice. Then 6. She rinsed them and left them to soak. She asked the house sitter to keep an eye on things, gathered money, and hurried toward the market before the heat grew even more punishing. The road already shimmered lightly. Dust rose under her sandals. At the meat stall, she bought pig heart and kidney for 105,000 dung, asking the vendor how best to stew them so they would strengthen rather than burden the body. Then she moved on to buy raw peanuts, half a kilo, then a little more, paying what she had to without hesitation. After that came a stew seasoning packet. On the way back, she stopped in the garden and gathered fresh mugwort, its bitter green scent rising in her hands. She returned home with her arms full and her mind fuller. In the kitchen, the heat felt almost cruel. It did not move. It settled over the room and wrapped itself around her as if trying to drive her away from the stove. But she stayed. She soaked the peanuts. She stirred the rice batter with the heavy stone mortar until her wrists ached. Sweat ran down her back, down the sides of her face, down her neck. Still, she kept stirring, because if she stopped, the batter would clump or burn. In another pot, the pig heart and kidneys simmered with mugwort and the herbal seasoning she had bought. The smell that rose was rich, bitter, nourishing, old-fashioned in the way healing often is. Tu Tien leaned close to the steam and thought of Jack again. Every turn of the spoon became a kind of whispered prayer. Sleep better tonight. Eat something warm. Stop carrying everything alone. Let your body remember what comfort feels like. Her back hurt. Her arms trembled. The roof seemed to trap all the summer fire inside the kitchen. But love in women like her was not abstract. It lived in labor, in repetition, in enduring the stove because the person you care for needs food more than you need rest. By the time afternoon softened, another task awaited them. Jack and Tu Tien walked with Uncle Dung to inspect a piece of land stretching across more than 2 hectares. The light over the hills had turned warm and golden. Trees stood green and abundant. There was a ready house on the property, at least at first glance, and enough space for farming, livestock, fruit trees, and the kind of peaceful life older people dream of after too many years of noise and disappointment. Uncle Dung moved through the orchard slowly, nodding with increasing satisfaction. Tu Tien helped by calling the owner, Uncle Trung, so the negotiation could happen directly. Money was discussed, terms were weighed. At last, the price came down from 200 million to 180 million. It seemed fair enough. It seemed even lucky. In those few minutes, with handshakes exchanged and transfer papers promised, the whole atmosphere filled with relief. A new beginning seemed possible. Not glamorous, not easy, but real. Tu Tien felt it too. Helping Uncle Dung secure a quiet place near their own farm brought her genuine peace. For a brief hour, the future looked almost gentle. Trees above them rustled softly, as if bearing witness to a chapter turning in the family's favor. But some hopes are built on a painted surface. When Uncle Dung returned later and looked more carefully, the truth tore straight through the illusion. The house was not merely old. It was a ruin. Crumbling walls, weak structure, a shell made to look more useful from a distance than it truly was. The place had been misrepresented, and the money already handed over now felt like a cruel theft. Rage took hold of him immediately. His face flushed dark red, his fists closed hard enough to whiten at the knuckles. 180 million was not a small misjudgment. It was the kind of loss that makes a man feel mocked, cornered, and desperate to strike back. In his fury, blame no longer stayed where it belonged. It searched for the nearest person tied to the transaction, and because Jack had helped arrange the viewing, anger twisted until it pointed directly at him. That was when the day turned violent. Uncle Dung gathered several men and stormed toward Jack without warning. Words came first, loud and sharp, then fists, then noise everywhere. Tu Tien barely had time to understand what was happening before the house itself began to shake under the force of it. A chair went over, bowls shattered against the floor, the table was struck and dragged sideways. One of the stew pots tipped, and the hot heart and mugwort broth she had prepared with such care spilled out across the ground. Batter splashed. Another pot crashed. Familiar objects, the ordinary things that made up their modest life, were smashed apart with careless fury. Jack was in the middle of it. She saw him take the blows, saw him stumble, saw him try to speak and shield and survive all at once. Her whole body went cold with terror even while the house burned with chaos. Violence did not only break furniture, it broke rhythm, trust, breath, and the simple belief that one could work honestly and return to safety. By the time the men were gone, silence felt unreal. It sat over the house like ash after a fire. Jack returned inside carrying bruises already darkening beneath the skin. His hands hurt. One side of his face looked swollen. Tu Tien was still shaking, but there was no space for collapse. She looked at the ruined kitchen, at the spilled stew, at the half-saved batter, and broken things around her, and then she did the only thing her heart knew to do. She went back to the food. Quietly, while still swallowing tears, she finished the remaining batches of Dung. She saved what could be saved. She reheated what little stew remained uncontaminated. Then she placed a bowl in front of Jack and sat with him amid the wreckage. He ate slowly. Then, with the tenderness of a man too wounded to fake anything, he praised her cooking. The words nearly undid her. Even with painful hands, he still reached to help cover the pots and cut the cakes into portions for the next day. The two of them sat there among overturned chairs and broken bowls, sharing food that had somehow survived. Each bite of Dung and each spoonful of the nourishing stew felt less like a meal than a medicine for two souls too tired to call their pain by name. Tu Tien looked at him with eyes full of regret, fear, and attachment. Their home had been torn open. Their peace had been dragged across the floor. Yet, in that small, wounded supper, love still held. The next morning, they went to the market together. Tu Tien carried the 3 batches of Dung. Jack, bruised and sore, went with her anyway. The early week market was quieter than usual, and for a moment she feared no one would stop. But she kept calling out gently to passing women and men, offering each bag for only 10,000 Dung. Some portions had more peanuts, some had less. All of them carried the labor of the day before and the stubborn refusal to surrender. Jack borrowed a stool for her, returned things for her, stood nearby and encouraged her with the silent steadiness that had survived the beating. Slowly, one bag sold, then another, then another. A customer smiled, another asked for 2. Coins gathered. Light returned in pieces no bigger than a market sale, but still, it returned. By the time the last batch was gone, Tu Tien and Jack looked at each other with the same exhausted relief. Their troubles were not over. The land issue still hurt. The violence still echoed. The broken bowls would still need replacing. But they had risen, carried the cakes to market, sold every last one, and come through the morning together. On the way home after the market emptied, neither of them spoke much. The road was dusty, the sun already climbing, and Jack's bruises looked darker in daylight than they had under the weak kitchen lamp. Tu Tien wanted to apologize again, for the land, for the meal, for the fear, for all the helplessness of the day before, but he only carried the empty containers and walked beside her. That silence was not distance. It was loyalty in its exhausted form. When their hands brushed once near the gate, neither pulled away. Even pain, they understood then, could become bearable if it was shared without turning bitter. Perhaps that was the deepest truth their hardship taught them. Sometimes love cannot stop the fists, cannot protect the pots, cannot keep a day from shattering, but it can ladle out soup in a ruined kitchen, cut cakes with injured hands, walk beside you to the market at dawn, and keep going until hope, small, quiet, and stubborn, begins to sell again.